everybody. No, for real. Hey, everybody. So hello and welcome to tonight's program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I am Alicia Garza, and I'm the principal of the Black Futures Lab. I am the Strategy and Partnerships Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and I am also one of the co-creators of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. I am super excited because we are here this evening with Rebecca Traister, the author of Big Girls Don't Cry, the election that changed everything for American women. That's a good one. All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women, and the Rise of the Independent Nation. And Good and Mad, the revolutionary power of women's anger. Tonight, we are discussing a topic that has been at the center of the national conversation this year, which is women's rage. And I just want to say quickly that it's been a hard couple of years. So we're really, really, really excited to have you here. And please, everyone, give Rebecca a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It is, I just want to say it's such an honor to share a stage with Alicia, who is also in the book.
Yes.
She is one of the most vibrant and nuanced voices on women, anger, power, politics, quoted in the book. So it's a real thrill to be on this stage with you right now.
It was such an honor, actually, to be interviewed and be included. And I remember that interview, and I remember during the interview getting really freaking angry. So we're going to do a little bit of that tonight. But I wanted to just start off, honestly, to say this is such a timely conversation. I, like many of you, watched a month, right, of Supreme Court nominee deliberations, certainly through my fair share of cuss words at the television, along with other objects. I watched as Dr. Christine Blasey Ford courageously told her story and her experience, knowing that she was following in the footsteps of people like Professor Anita Hill, who also courageously put everything on the line to kind of share her experiences in front of a panel of angry white men. And so we saw that repeated again, although there may have been different voices there than there were in 1991.
And some of the same, depressingly.
And some of the same.
Really, yeah.
And I also was incredibly moved because every time I wanted to throw something at the TV, I would hear screaming coming from the Senate chambers. And somebody screaming, "I do not consent." Mm-hmm. Somebody screaming all kinds of things, right? And actually during the vote itself, I mean, I was sitting there and I was watching the television and I just started to bawl because as they were going through the vote, they kept having to say, "Sergeant in arms, clear the chamber," because you would hear women screaming, "This is not okay." And so I want us to kind of open up with that, and I want to hear from you. Well, first, as I was thinking about what we would talk about tonight, I really wanted my first question to be, what the fuck is going on?
Right. Really, any of our guests is as good as mine. What the fuck is going on? Well, no, we know exactly what's going on. There's a concentrated effort to control power at the very top in a way that will actually work to suppress the power of protesters and mass social movements going forward, and also to reverse the progress that has been made by centuries worth of social and political movements that have, via mass action, protest, electoral activation, like civic participation, worked over the course of American history to make this country slightly better a little bit at a time. And now the power that has been challenged by that history wants to put in place mechanisms, is working to preserve their power by ensuring a court that can reverse all kinds of lots of that progress, not just Roe, which has been talked about a lot, but further gut voting rights, gut collective bargaining rights, the ability of workers to organize. That's the big picture of what's going on, which is power tightening at the top in reaction, in part to the anger coming from those with less power. The thing that I'm so glad that you talked about the protesters, because even before there were the allegations of assault, I was so moved by the protesters in the original hearings. And there's a way in which a political media now behaves as though the only challenge that was brought to Kavanaugh came with the assault allegations and the protests that happened in response. But in fact, I was so moved the first time, and this was, a few weeks before I was going to publish this book. I was very worried during the summer that there wasn't active resistance to the Kavanaugh nomination, that everybody was going to roll over, that the Democrats were going to roll over, and I think there are very many legitimate ways to criticize the Democrats' approach to the Kavanaugh nomination. But my fear going into September was there's not going to be any challenge to this, what I understood to be this stranglehold that a Trump administration was going to put in place via a lifetime appointment. And so for me, the opening day of hearings, and Linda Sarsour I believe, was the first person to stand up and scream. And then it wasn't just Linda. It wasn't just Bob Bland. It wasn't just the next woman or the next woman. It was this endlessly renewable rage coming from women who would come into the chamber, stand up, scream, be taken out, arrested, and then more women would come in, stand up and scream. And that was moving to me even before we got to the assault allegations and the protests that erupted after them. And for me, I would say, especially after the pain of watching the testimony day and watching Christine Blasey Ford have to tell her story within such a narrow range of expression that we all understood she had to stay between these lines, that she could not raise her voice, that she could not be angry on her own behalf, that she could not appear anything other than solicitous, polite, deferential, reasonable, science-based, in order to make her story, in order for her story to be taken seriously and be heard as credible. And then having watched Brett Kavanaugh come in and be able to use anger as a rhetorical tool to bolster his position. He could use the snarling bluster and fury to amplify the righteousness of his cause. And that is very much in line with what I've been writing about in this book, about how the fury that we take seriously politically in this country has always been the fury of white men, starting with the founding fathers and the way that we fetishize their fury. But when that fury has been aimed at a white patriarchal government, it is discounted and marginalized and written off as crazy or dangerous. And yet we revere the anger and are trained to reflexively respect and treat as diagnostic the anger of angry, powerful white men. And I'd watch that happen, and it was so sad to me to watch that and understand that night that was probably going to work for him, that he was going to get to use that weapon, and it was going to cement his place for his lifetime on this court that was going to then exert control over so many bodies and so many lives. The most moving point for me was the next day, seeing the video of Ana Maria Archila and Maria Gallagher in that elevator. And they weren't the only ones. There are others, Jess Morales confronting Ted Cruz, and
also with my squad,
yeah,
domestic workers,
and Allison Turkos confronting Joe Manchin. And there were these activists going, the power of seeing those two women in that elevator, pointing fingers, doing a thing that we have been told we're not allowed to do, pointing fingers at a powerful white man and demanding, you look at me when I tell you the story of my life and my experience and why I'm in this elevator. You look at me, meet my eye. It was so powerful to me that was what you described, that sense of like just being overwhelmed and crying. And I've heard that audio so many times since, and still when I hear it and I can hear their voices shaking with anger, it makes me incredibly emotional and tear up.
This was so timely. I mean, you really kind of got in that groove, right, of really trying to capture what has certainly been building for a long time, but has certainly kind of found its expression most recently, I would say, with the Women's March right after the inauguration of the current president, who we'll call 45 for our purposes. And so I'm just curious, like, what inspired you to write this book at this time? Certainly, I'm sure you could have like seen into the future and known that we were going to be, in this madness. But at that moment when you said, I've got to put this out in the world, why anger? Why not just organizing or advocacy or activism?
There are two parts to that answer. The first is very sort of practical, where I got the idea, because I'd been a feminist journalist for a very long time, and I'd written out of anger. Anger had always informed my work, but I never thought of it as the lens or the organizing principle or something, a framework through which to look at the kind of politics I write about, the power structures I write about, or the history. I just hadn't thought of it that way. And so the original idea came actually in that period between the election and the inauguration, the week between Christmas and New Year's, 2016, 2017. And I was really wrestling with, what is my job? What is my work going into this administration? What purpose can I serve? And which gets to the second part of what I want to do. But I was wrestling with it, and I couldn't think clearly. Like, I couldn't come up with, like, what is my path here? What are my responsibilities? And I was trying to express this to my husband. We were out on a walk, and I was like, I just can't even think straight because I'm just so angry. And it's like the anger was clouding my brain, and it was like there was a bubbling, boiling. I'd actually said that same day to Melissa Harris Perry, I'd said, I feel like my brain is boiling, like it's bubbling out of my head. I can't control it. And he said, well, maybe you should write about the anger. And as soon as he said it, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's what. And it's not to be clear, like, this is not a book about me or my anger. Like, there are a couple passages about me, but suddenly, as soon as he said it, it was like, everything fell into place about the stories that I suddenly felt were really important to tell about what had happened, stretching back into some of the history that I'd learned, anger between allies, anger. I mean, all of a sudden I saw this outline for a book that I wanted to write. The second part, and one of the reasons that it also clicked into place very quickly, is because part of what I was wrestling with when I was trying to figure out what my job and my role was a sense of my job as a white feminist in this moment. And I had been in a conversation a couple of weeks before the election, like a roundtable podcast with a bunch of women, some of whom had been Hillary people, some of whom had been Bernie people, and were now out campaigning for Hillary or talking about Hillary. And one of the women, Michaela Angela Davis, said, what about the left white men? Why aren't they out with us? Like, some of us have been Bernie people, some of us have been Hillary people, and yet we're all out on the road together. Where are these young white guys on the left? White men are the demographic that is most likely to vote for Trump, and here we're in the panic mode. It's 2 weeks before. Where are these young guys out knocking doors? And she said, I mean, come on, guys, come get your boys. And I'd never thought before about that kind of demographic responsibility, in part because we don't ask white people, and certainly not white men, to be responsible for their own demographic. But after the election, and after 53% of white women voted for Trump, which was not a surprise to me because I have written about these dynamics in the past, and white women have always voted for Republicans except in 92 and 96. And in 92, Bill Clinton ran on a very explicitly
racist.
Yes. Right. Tough on crime agenda, and left the campaign trail to go home and execute Ricky Ray Rector. And white women voted for him in 92. And then in 96, like a perplexing number of them voted for Ross Perot. And that's the only reason that a majority didn't vote for a Republican. Otherwise, 56% of white women had voted for Mitt Romney over Barack Obama in 2012. So I knew, and I had begun to think after the election about go get your boys. and think about my responsibility to go get my girls and to address whiteness within a women's movement and outside of a women's movement, within progressive politics and for those on the margins of progressive politics. And somehow in my mind, very quickly, the idea of writing about anger was a good framework to begin to do some of that work. And that was all before the Women's March, the airport protests, women running for office in unprecedented numbers, before the teacher strikes, before Me Too, before the immigration policy protests.
Yep. Y'all ready to get into it? Because I'm like, we got some things to talk about. So, yes, 53% of white women did vote for the 45th president of the United States, the current one. And, you know, I think you write about this a lot, right? Like, you talk about how there are historical divides within the women's movement that are racialized, they are classed. And so I want to get into that a little bit. And I'd like us to start off by just talking about 2016, because there was a lot of stuff going on. And from my perspective, coming from the Black Lives Matter side of things, there was a different realm of anger that folks were operating in. And it felt really clear that the different realms of anger that were motivating people to move were not in sync. And that was causing some serious tension. So I'd love to just hear your take. Like, what was happening with this Bernie thing and the Hillary thing? And then what did we miss in terms of how Trump came to be? Oh, I said I wasn't going to say his name. Well, he got lucky with that one. But what did we miss there? What big question, but...
Big question. Because obviously we missed a lot. And I don't actually think that any of us is quite at a place where we can fully wrap our heads around all the different dynamics that were in play. So I'll describe a couple of them. One of the things that I'm really obsessed with is the way that when a challenge to power comes from a less powerful entity toward a more powerful entity, it is viewed as disruptive, disordered, problematic, threatening, scary. Uncivil, right? And this is exactly the language being used right now by the right about the mob. There was a Fox News guy, Todd Starnes, who referred to those women yelling during the protest as screaming animals. Trump compared the protesters to a mob of arsonists. I mean, this is exactly the kind of language, and it's the same. I write in the book that the place where the first instance that I really thought about this was after Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, and I was reading news coverage of it, and he was taken for a rough ride by police and died of his injuries afterward, and there were protests, and all the news coverage I wrote, this was a real eye-opener for me, which is why I focus on this. All the news coverage said the violence started when protesters began to throw rocks. And that was the place where I first understood in a real-time way that the violence of having killed the less powerful man, the powerful entity, the state, having killed the less powerful man, was basically indiscernible as violence, because that was just how power works. But when somebody picks up a rock and throws it, then it becomes disruptive and the violence starts and disorder starts. And that has been a framework that's been very useful to me. And I bring it up because there were all sorts of internal anxieties about whose anger was disruptive during the 2016 election. Now, there were certain kinds of anger that I think were discouraged and laughed at. There was a lot of dismissal of the notion that that racism and misogyny were key in this moment. A lot of people who were trying to write about it and people who were trying to talk about it were kind of dismissed as hysterics because, in fact, look, this was the party of Barack Obama. This is the party in which Hillary Clinton was inevitably going to be the president. In fact, these were the people of color, a woman, they had the power. They were the establishment. And so to be to be worried about the kinds of rhetoric that the Trump campaign was openly trading on was being a little hysterical, right? In fact, I was often told that the language that he was using, the racist, misogynistic language, was fundamentally disqualifying. Right. So there's a kind of anger that's discouraged. Meanwhile, Trump is out there rousing anger, using exactly that rhetoric, an incredibly powerful anger that is happening in response to some of the symbolic victories of Barack Obama and the inevitable presidency of Hillary Clinton, and the powerful change being made by activist groups, including Black Lives Matter. And yet the actual anger at that and anxiety about the impact of that kind of racism and misogyny was downplayed. Then you have Bernie, who was also really terrific at communicating a crucial and righteous anger about economic inequality. And he was great at that. He and Trump were both able to use their anger in ways that they were applauded for as a political tool, right? And they were very good at it. Hillary was both bad at it, just oratorically, not gifted at conveying passion. I think, that it's very hard to divorce her oratorical gifts from the kinds of messages that she was probably sent for her entire life. This is where it gets really complicated always to talk about Hillary. And when she talked too loudly into a microphone, she was accused of being shrill and loud, and she was yelling. But there was another thing internally that then happens, which is that when protesters when Black Lives Matter protesters disrupt both Hillary and Bernie, they are cast by the political media and by the supporters of those campaigns as fundamentally disruptive, right? You screwed up the events. Like, no, that's not. No, they're good on this. Trust us, they're good on this.
Apparently we screwed up the election.
Yeah, right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Not the 53%.
Not the 53%.
But Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Just checking.
Yes. Pretty much.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like within a progressive sphere. It's not just like, the anger of progressives as the less powerful, the anger of the masses or of the oppressed or the subjugated is the thing that's cast as disruptive. Within a progressive sphere, the anger of the less powerful entity is cast as the problematic force.
Well, let's dive in a little bit more. Because this isn't the first time that anger has been written about. And I was thinking through some of my teachers and mentors, and I started thinking about Audre Lorde, of course. And she wrote a beautiful piece called The Uses of Anger, where she's really getting into this dialogue about essentially what's getting in the way of us building the kind of movement together that will be impactful and accountable and effective. And so, if I can, she says, anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. For it is in the painful process of this translation that we identify who are our allies with whom we have grave differences, and who are our genuine enemies. Anger is loaded with information and energy. When I speak of women of color, I do not only mean Black women. The woman of color who is not Black who charges me with rendering her invisible by assuming that her struggles with racism are identical with my own has something to tell me that I better learn from, lest we both waste ourselves fighting the truths between us. If I participate knowingly or otherwise in my sister's oppression and she calls me on it, to answer her anger with my only blankets, the substance of our exchange with reaction. It wastes energy. And yes, it is very difficult to stand still, and to listen to another woman's voice delineate an agony I do not share or one to which I myself have contributed. So we get into this in the book. where essentially, yes, there was a lot of deep misogyny that was moving on the left. And as our kind of teachers have taught us, we cannot separate these dynamics of race and gender, right? So I guess my question here is, what can we learn in this moment, 2 years in, right, about the kinds of alliances that we need to be building? How do we move through these dynamics where, frankly, I'm a feminist, you're a feminist, but I think for a lot of my crew, they're like, well, white feminism is not my thing. And there's just not a lot of people who know about black feminism, which is literally it is a clarification of how it ain't feminism if it doesn't include all of us. So, how do we do it?
Well, I think that one of the major questions posed by the book is coalition and a better coalition possible? And I can't claim to answer that question. There are a lot of different voices in the book offering opinions. I think that Audre Lorde's vision is one of the more optimistic visions because, and it's one that is echoed by Linda Sarsour, who says contentious dialogue is by design. That's in the run-up to the Women's March, where so many of the very old angers within a women's movement were brought to the fore because in literally the days after 94% of black women vote for Hillary Clinton and 53% of white women vote for now 45. I'm gonna start doing it too. Okay. In the days after, it is white women who suggest a march on Washington and promptly call it the Million Woman March, which is an appropriation of a demonstration staged and led by black women, itself an outgrowth or a response to demonstrate the Million Man March. And what could be more emblematic of the sort of failures of taking responsibility and the impulse toward appropriation than those dynamics? But what happened in that from those first days in which you saw so much old history, and there is so much history, it extends back centuries, of women of color, black women leading the way, doing the revolutionary thinking and organizing, and then being erased within the movement that they've laid the groundwork for. And that is a lot of the history of the women's movement extending back to the beginning of time in this country. And so in this moment, in the days after this election, in which so many white women are truly like horrified, furious, and traumatized, I don't mean to take anything away from the anger and shock that so many people, it's fundamental, it's crucial, this anger and shock felt by women who had previously not been angry in that way, had not seen certain things in the world in that way. But what happened in the intervening period was that women from other movements came in, women of color. They insisted on the ideological tenets and principles of the Women's March being intersectional, making clear how oppressions are interlocked. Mm-hmm. They made clear that we were going to have the conversation about race. There was not going to be a Women's March if there was not an open and often very difficult conversation about this kind of oppression and white supremacy within the history of a women's movement. There were all kinds, of course, immediately it was written about as, is it more divisive? Is it the women's movement is more divided than ever? By the way, these kinds of angers and resentments and inequalities within progressive spheres are in every mass movement. It is not unique to the women's movement. Mm-hmm. And quickly the divisions were used to sort of say, oh, this is all falling apart. Well, what happened is it was the biggest single one-day political protest in this country's history. Mm-hmm. And those millions of women many of whom were very new to activism, something like a third of them, it was the first protest they'd ever attended, were there marching side by side with the domestic workers, alongside banners about environmental racism.
That's right.
Criminal justice. And there were signs, there was contentious dialogue. There was the famous sign, "I'll see all you nice white ladies at the next Black Lives Matter march," right?
We're still waiting.
And
Got it.
you know, this is I want to be optimistic, but I'm also very keenly aware of my whiteness, right? The white lady being optimistic about other white ladies is not always persuasive. And that's why part of my job at this point is to actually talk to white women about the history, the context, the power dynamics. Because if I can't just be optimistic that things are going to get better, I do agree with Linda Sarsour and Audre Lorde that the contentious dialogue and the difficult conversations and the anger between potential allies can be salubrious and generative, which is the word that Audre Lorde uses, that it can produce a stronger movement. I think that the cacophony and differences within a women's movement are its strength, because it permits us the chance to grow and change with the times, and it permits us to be better than we have been in the past. But that doesn't mean we just get to be hopeful about being better. It means we have to get educated. It means we have to participate. It means we have to do the work of learning the history, of taking, and of listening to the other women, right? So part of it is about listening to the people who are angry at us and acknowledging the ways that we profit from white supremacy, even if we are, bound and determined to fight it and to challenge it. It's to do the hard work of looking at ourselves and our own positions within a power structure, and not only calling other white women to account, but calling ourselves to account too. And it's really hard. But it has to happen if we're going to get better. I want to believe we can get better. And there are other people who are reasonably far less optimistic about the possibility of getting better.
I feel optimistic sometimes. And then sometimes I'm like, if you don't, you know what I'm saying? So, for example, I was feeling all optimistic. I wrote a whole piece about collaboration and, cynicism will not build a movement. And I still feel that way. And I think it's important for people who are coming into a movement and have never seen themselves as political, or maybe thought they didn't have to be political anymore, and now they're showing up. It's important for us to have open doors. However, that doesn't mean that we don't hold people accountable, and we have to find that balance. So I was having a conversation the other day on Facebook. It wasn't a conversation, I made a statement. And I basically said, well, white ladies, y'all are consistent. At least. No surprises here, right? And somebody who I know, who I will not name, said, well, my name isn't Susan Collins. And I was out there protesting, and I was like, because sometimes what happens, right, with anger is that people get mad that you're angry instead of asking what you're angry about. And so in that moment, rather than listening and saying, yeah, it's true, we got a lot of work to do. What else can I be doing to shore up the team? It was like, there was I called it being white womaned, right? There was a lot of tears and a lot of feelings and a lot of things that had nothing to do with what actually needed to be talked about, which is that in the moments where we need white ladies to show up, there is often a choice that's being made to continue going down the same path. And we can talk about unity all we want, but under crisis, under pressure, right, our habits come out. So I'm just curious, how do we balance that? Because I don't want us to be cynical in this moment. I actually need us to be really mad. I need us to stay mad. I need us to be clear about who we're mad at. And I also need us to be open to hearing the places where we haven't done what we needed to do and be committed to dealing with it. So I can't do all that work for the white ladies.
No,
So what
that's
can
why
we do?
Well, that's why I feel to some extent it's certainly not the responsibility of non-white women to deal with the white women, right? And the thing and which is why, like, as a white feminist, TM, I feel a great deal of responsibility in trying to address this, right? Without being overly optimistic, also without being like weirdly performatively self-flagellating, which is another thing. Like, don't do that.
Yeah,
I don't,
please.
that's like, that doesn't, right?
No kid gloves.
Right. I think the thing that you said, and sort of the only prescriptive thing I say in this book, a lot of this book is about the history, the context, the power dynamics. It's descriptive. It's not like, this is not a self-help book that's like, go out and be angry. Because in part, what it's attempting to reveal are the costs of being angry. But pretty much the only prescriptive thing I say, and it's based, in fact, on something that Alicia and a couple of other, actually almost every woman that I interviewed, said in one form or another, which is nobody's ever asked me why I'm angry before. And so the only prescriptive thing I would say that applies to your question is that if you want to be the better white feminist, it's not necessarily about what you say. It's about listening to other women, being curious about what they're angry about, even if part of what they're angry about is you. And asking, being curious, hearing the response, and then being willing to follow and consider reshaping your view and the way that you might participate. There's this line between expressive and receptive, right? And a lot of the questions that I have gotten as I've gone out and started to talk about this book is, how should I express myself more angrily? How can I do that? And it's like, it doesn't have to be about what you say. It can be about how you hear and what you are curious about in the world. And I think that that's one sort of constructive step, asking other women who you think might be angry at you, or just angry in a different way from the way that you're angry. What are you angry about? Why? When?
Y'all ready? Because we got time. Can we go back to Hillary?
Oh, sure.
Because, she was doing a lot of interviews and stuff today.
Oh, yeah. I didn't see all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw something that I was not psyched about.
Did y'all see these interviews? Well, she was asked her opinion on what it's going to take to change what's going on in this country in the aftermath of the SCOTUS hearings, and apparently she and former President Clinton are doing a nationwide tour.
This was the thing that was the only part that I heard.
Yeah.
Was that she was going to do a tour with Bill.
And she, she had some choice things to say, but one of the main things that she said was that we weren't going to get back to civility until the Democrats retook power. You think that's true?
I don't care about getting back to civility. So, like, that's not my goal. And I'm not, I think civility is a concept that's designed to protect the powerful, because the powerful determine what's civil and what's not civil, and calls for civility are always designed to insulate those whose incivility is codified into law and policy. And so I don't give a shit about civility or getting back there. And I think that the conversation, the fact that this is what political commentators and right-wing talking heads and Democratic Party leaders want to talk about is an indication of the kind of power level that they're operating from, right? And you know what? Like 80% of the activism, 90%, 95% of the activism out there is not about interrupting dinners. But by the way, I love that people are interrupting dinners, okay? As a part of what is happening. And it is following the lead of a media and a party power structure to behave as though that's the only thing that's happening. That is absorbing a fundamentally conservative, reactionary talking point and spitting it back out as the reality that that's the form activism is taking. Look around. A historic number of women, many of them women of color, many of them running on very progressive platforms and agenda, are on the ballot in November. There is an unprecedented wave of women into electoral politics. There is also an unprecedented wave of women and men into civic activism that's not about interrupting dinners, that's about organizing, canvassing, door knocking, registering people to vote, fundraising, spreading the word, educating each other about the history and the context that we're talking about here. Participating in strikes. There are fast food worker strikes happening during these weeks, both fighting for a higher minimum wage, fighting for 15, and McDonald's workers striking in response to sexual harassment. There were teachers' strikes that spread through states where striking is illegal. You know how fucking brave you have to be to go on strike in a state where striking is illegal? And that happened. And many of them won new bargains and higher pay. There's Me Too, the hashtag movement, which came out of Tarana Burke's movement, that had repercussions for extremely powerful men who helped to shape our political narrative. Some of the powerful men who would be sitting there jawing about civility if they still had their jobs as morning show anchors.
Hello.
Right? And some of them don't because they stuck their penises in people's faces. All right? Like, we've never had that kind of repercussion before. And then there are the protesters. There are the people yelling. There are the people who, and that has communicative value. Let me tell you, it tells people, for those of you who are moved to do your activism that way, by interrupting dinners, or by screaming at people in elevators, it's so powerful. That's a connective force. Don't tell me it's not civil. It lets people know that there are others who feel the same. It lets somebody watching on a computer somewhere very far away from Washington, D.C., who's livid and upset and sad and so furious about what's happening. It lets them hear a voice that reflects that sadness and fury back to them and know that somebody is yelling at this guy and makes them understand that they're not living in isolation, that they are part of a mass anger at the kind of power abuses that we're living with right now. There is tremendous value to that incivility, but it's just a part of what's happening.
So let's let go of that civility thing and let's start moving towards that building power thing and transforming power. Because quite frankly, it is great to get more women elected. It's great to get more folks of color elected. But if we're putting people in the same structures that are ultimately not made for our power, then we're really just replacing one group of people with another, but we're not actually transforming how it works. So you said two things that were fascinating to me in this book. One was this piece around anger and self-care. So there was something in here where you said, or you interviewed someone who said something to the degree of like, folk always want us to move through anger to a thing. Yeah? So you can't just be angry, because anger is explosive and it's considered divisive and it's considered to be not productive, particularly when it's coming from women. But isn't there a conversation to be had about how it is that we use anger productively, AKA, how do we keep ourselves from using anger in ways that cuts us off at the knees when we need to be moving together? And the other piece of my question, frankly, is, with all the rhetoric that I hear every day when I turn on CNN about extremists and mobs and all of that thing, is there hope for women's anger to finally be seen as what has transformed this country? Is there hope for that?
Okay. So the first question.
Oh yeah, and 5 minutes till Q&A, so get your questions ready.
So the first part of that, and it's really fascinating because there's so much baggage attached to anger as a divisive, confrontational, fundamentally poisonous and corrosive force, right? I think that women hear a lot more about that, about how it poisons us and fundamentally deforms us. It makes us unattractive, ugly, threatening. Of course, the way it's framed depends so much on our race and class position and power that we have when we voice it. But in almost all women, it's discouraged in one way or another, unless it's anger on behalf of a white patriarchy, in which case you get Phyllis Schlafly and Susan Collins and the women of the Tea Party and the women shaking their fists at kids trying to integrate schools, right? So that kind of women's anger is pretty much the only one that's encouraged by a power structure, and it's anger that is deployed on behalf of the power structure. But otherwise, we're told all the time that our anger is explosive and destructive and bad for us, physically bad for us. And I don't want to pretend that there aren't those destructive qualities in anger. And part of what we're talking about tonight is how anger between allies can sever coalitions, right? It's true. But what I do want to talk about is a message that women are never given, which is that there are all kinds of positive, joyous, liberating aspects of anger. And that some of the poison and corrosive impact come from being told that we're not to express it. That if we express it, it's going to be bad for us. It is going to make us unattractive and scary and undermine the very project we're so committed to seeing through if we start speaking in angry tones. And so we hold it in, or we redirect it in places where it's not really supposed to go. And it can explode. To me, I think that there is a very valid argument that to change the way we receive and hear and respect women's anger and acknowledge it as politically consequential, as part of one of the key forces that has reshaped and transformed this country over centuries, if we value it with even a fraction of the value we offer to white men's anger, to powerful white men's anger, it could actually... Anger could be just an emotion that's integrated in the full, range of human expression and rational reaction. But the other thing is, anger in a political context is connective. It's not just divisive. And there are a lot of examples of this. One of the places where it was made clearest to me was when I went to Georgia in the summer of 2017 and talked to some of the newly activated suburban white women who had been politically apathetic, had lived in red areas, never put a yard sign out because to have voiced their sort of private democratic leanings would have been disruptive, would have made them unattractive within their communities, would have caused problems. And then in the wake of the 2016 election, were so mad that they yelled. Mm-hmm. And then when they yelled, they discovered that a woman down the block they became audible to each other. And then once they realized that there was a woman 2 doors down who'd felt the same way all this time, and that they'd been living for decades thinking that they were the only ones because they'd never expressed their dissent. Then they became audible to each other, and the next thing you know, they'd joined Indivisible and were spending 24 hours a day knocking on doors, not just I was there right before the John Ossoff election and he lost. They had been doing it for other candidates, and they have kept doing it since. And they are out there right now working for Stacey Abrams and Lucy McBath.
Hey.
And God, they really are. They really are. They are politically activated people. And it does not mean that their progressivism is perfect and that everybody, but they are committed in a new way. And part of that was because the anger bubbled over in a way that could then draw them together into coalition and the beginnings of organization.
That's right.
Anger is part of what does that. And I do think we have to stop disavowing it and start crediting it. If you look back at the movements that have transformed this nation, from abolition, suffrage, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's movement of the 1970s, you will find at the beginning of all those movements women who were angry at injustice. And that anger was what spurred them out of their homes, out of the domestic sphere, into public speaking roles, into scholarship, into legal work, to start fighting cases that were going to transform the legal system, into petitioning for their own freedom. You find that at the beginning of all these movements, and yet we're never taught to respect women's anger as politically consequential, as patriotic, as key to the slow process of trying to make this country a more just place. But it is right there. It is the undercurrent under all of it. And I think we're not taught it because the power structure fears it, because it knows what it can do. You know what happened over the past 2 weeks, and the Republicans out there talking about the angry mobs of screaming animals at the same time that they're braying about how their base is so angry.
Right.
They know the power of anger. They want their base to be angry. They're saying it's disqualifying, and they're trying to gin it up on their side. They know the power of anger, and we should know the power of our anger too.
I heard that. So if y'all have questions, we want you to come back here to the mic. There's got to be tons of questions. And for the overflow folks, those questions are coming too. I just want to thank you while we're waiting for people to kind of get together and get at you. I want to thank you for writing this book. And I want to thank you for writing this book because, honestly, it felt good to me to be reading about how useful anger is in this moment and using very contemporary, like 6 months ago, year ago examples. And I feel like for me, as somebody who's plugged in, I was like, yes, this is amazing. But I just want this book to make it into the hands of someone who's like, where can I go? Who else is as angry as I am? And what can we do about the things that are happening? So I see a huge line back here. In fact, it's so long, they're like going outside the door to have space. So let's do that. Please.
Hi there, my name is Sabrina. So just a very quick story. Right after the election in 2016, I went to the Emerge California fundraising thing. Everybody was really downhearted, and because we were trying to raise money for women candidates, and Hillary had just lost, and all of that stuff. And I had a side conversation with a woman who was kind of like a big cheese in this organization, and she asked me who I thought would be a great presidential candidate, and I said, I think Elizabeth Warren would be an awesome candidate because she embraces that anger on behalf of everyone, whether it's economic injustice or racial injustice, whatever it is. She's not afraid to say what's on her mind. And the response that I got was, oh, she's a little too left of center for us. And I thought, really? So I guess my question is, I give that as background to wonder, what is it about Democrats, forget the Republicans, what is it about Democrats that are afraid of moving left of center if we don't really give a shit about civility?
There you go. Way to pop that can right open. Let's do it.
Yeah.
What's going on with Democrats?
What is wrong with Democrats? I mean, this is... yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree. But the thing is, I actually, if that was a fundraiser that you went to right after the election, one of the things that we're seeing is that, and this is the way I think it needs to happen, because that top power, the civility warriors are never going to say, yes, let's move the party left, right? Right? So what has to happen is it has to come from the bottom and restructure the party from the bottom. And this is, I have very left politics. and I didn't support Bernie. I would have loved to have voted for Bernie. Like, I would have happily voted for Bernie. I want a Nordic social state. I want, like, I very much, no, I do. But one of the reasons practically that I wasn't a Bernie supporter in the primary is because I was very worried about what happened if you got one guy at the top of a fundamentally centrist party with Republican obstructionism and the set of policies that I cared very deeply about couldn't go through because you had one person at the top of a party that wasn't prepared to put through those policies. Now, I'm not saying that the Hillary option was like the future of left-leaning progressivism, although she had left people working for her too, and I was more optimistic about her ability to move lefter than she'd been in the past. But the thing that's happening now is the thing that that if it works and we elect more left and progressive candidates, and that is who at least some portion of the women and men who are running, many of them are new candidates, are coming in with a far bolder, far lefter agenda. And that's the kind of remaking of the party that has to happen, because it's never going to come from that top down. And so, but this is part of, if that's something you care about, then that's part of how you engage. You find the candidates on a local level before we start worrying about the presidential candidates. And I do think that we're going to have presidential. I wrote a profile of Elizabeth Warren this summer, and I feel rather confident that she's going to run for president. I think we're going to, we have left candidates running in all kinds of races around the country. And if that's something you care about, and if that's something that people in this room care about, is moving the party left, then that's a very clear pathway into how you can participate. You can seek out those candidates, not just around here. You live in the Bay Area. You got great candidates. You got my favorite member of the House of Representatives, Barbara Lee. And but there are all kinds of organizations. There's Sister District, there's Run for Something, there's Higher Heights. There are all kinds of organizations that are doing, that are remaking structures that you don't have to go through the Democratic Party in order to help transform it. And so that's a really clear pathway to activism, perhaps for you and for other people in this, is trying to remake the party and make it lefter.
We're going to take these 5 audience questions.
And also, folks, please make sure they are questions. Thank you.
My question is about journalism, and I'm a big fan of real journalism, and I'm a big opponent of the way our president is maligning journalists. But at the same time, many publications, the New York Times, I'm really disappointed in how they cut out voter of color stories, how they publish anonymous op-eds, and it's all just feels like it's going downhill in terms of those forces that say they would like us to support them because they're journalism, but I feel like they're genuflecting to 45. And I'd like to know what you think us as progressives who value real journalism can do to make sure it's accountable.
You can support the publications and the reporting that you do value and that you find instructive, and there's a lot of great reporting out there, and it's not always coming from there is great reporting in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the big places, but if you're finding reporting and journalism that speaks to you, you can support it, you can share it, you can pay for it if there's a subscription, you can support that journalism and make it more visible. You are absolutely right, and I think looking at my own industry, it's another whole set of questions about power. I noted there was a tweet that got together all the news alerts that went out when the Senate voted. I don't know if you saw it. I know Lydia Polgreen, who runs the Huffington Post, tweeted it. And it was 4 different news alerts. And the 2 most powerful news organizations, I think, was the New York Times and the Washington Post. Their news alert was, Senate votes to confirm Brett Kavanaugh after partisan battle. And 2 others, the Huffington Post and maybe the Daily Beast, but places that would be considered more marginal, right? Not the, said, Senate votes to confirm Kavanaugh after multiple allegations of sexual assault. And that makes a difference. That right there is a view of the power that journalists have and that institutions have to shape the story even as it's playing out. And so that's the stuff we have to keep our eyes open for and respond to. and you know, it's the media is a power structure like politics, and a lot of it is looking to the journalists who are working within institutions to change them, again, sort of from the bottom up in some cases, and to new kinds of outlying institutions that are presenting the news in different ways that aren't so tied and indebted to the power structures themselves.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. So, a quick question, 2 parts, however. So, what was your most favorite or the most valuable thing that you learned in writing this book? And what resources would you suggest that people go to if they want more after your book to learn more?
Great questions.
That's a great question. The most surprising thing that I learned, well, there's actually a particular story, which I didn't really know about, which is what happened at the Stonewall Inn. Part of the process of being a journalist, a feminist journalist, has been learning all kinds of history I was never taught. And I sort of knew a popular version of the gay rights movement as it erupted out of the Stonewall Inn on a June night and a series of June nights in 1969. I understood the gay rights movement as a fundamentally white male led movement, and I kind of knew as a footnote in my brain that, like, oh, Sylvia Rivera was at Stonewall that night. And I kind of, and Marsha P. Johnson, there was like something that was in my head that was like, I think it was more complicated than that. And I went back and I read, and there are all kinds of conflicting reports about what happened at Stonewall. And so there's not one set story, but a lot of the reports all reflect a similar thing, which is that 2 female identifying people of color and a lesbian named Stormy DeLaviere were 3 of the initial inciters of what became the insurrection at the Stonewall Inn. And I had never heard of Stormy DeLaviere. She was a lesbian of color, and she reportedly fought police when they took her out of the bar. And among the many stories, there are some stories that she got out of the paddy wagon or that she pulled the handcuffs off. And one of the most common is that she turned to the crowd that had gathered outside of Stonewall and asked, "What are you guys waiting? Why don't you guys do something?" And so that was going back and seeing that history and being like, oh my God, how is it possible that this was the history of not that long ago? And they just made a movie about it called Stonewall. And the protagonist was a white, cisgendered man from the Midwest.
Baby.
Right? So that was the sort of thing that I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I don't know this stuff. Right? And there's a lot in this world that I don't know. As for resources, you know what, I have to do a whole bibliography. The book I did so quickly that I have footnotes and I have references within the text, but I actually need to sit down and just write the list of books because, God, so much of this history is there and it's so good. I would point, first thing to do is read Audre Lorde. Read the biographies of Pauli Murray, who laid the intellectual and legal groundwork for civil rights law and gender discrimination law. She has been cited by both Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg for being the kind of intellectual godmother, the person who did the thinking that got us to where we are legally around gender and race. She was a non-gender conforming Black woman, and she was a genius. Read Brittany Cooper's incandescently great book, Eloquent Rage, that was published earlier this year. Going back to the biographies of many of these women. I read the biography of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, Flo Kennedy, who was a Black feminist lawyer who was one of the most outspoken, profane, and hilarious of the second wave, and whose name is not widely known. Go back and read. There's very little popular journalism or there's very little pop history about the suffrage movement and its serious complexities. That is an education that I never got. and that I am still getting. I'm still reading about it and trying to learn about the way that race was leveraged, about the way that class was leveraged within a suffrage movement, and also about the length and duration of a suffrage movement. That the movement up until the 19th Amendment, which is of course incomplete, is 80 years. And then of course another 45 before you get to the Voting Rights Act. And that's the thing we have to think about now as we're tempted to say, oh, the midterms or 2020. No, no, no. This is the rest of our lives.
How many more questions are there? Because I want to make sure we get them all. Okay, cool.
Hi.
You're good.
My question is, how do you separate your anger from your sadness?
I love you.
Do you want to answer that? You speak about this in the book.
I do. Oh, wow. So for me, my anger is sadness. That's what's underneath it. And so it is so all good to like let those tears flow. And it's sadness about all kinds of things, right? So when you and I were in conversation, you told me the story that Congresswoman Barbara Lee told you about Shirley Chisholm. Do y'all know that this woman, the first black woman to run for president, literally cried all the time? She cried all the time because she was fighting pretty much everybody. Like, the white men didn't have her back, for sure, threw her under the bus 100 million times. And then the black men threw her under the bus 100 million times. And she was like, yo, does anybody love me? And Barbara Lee, who didn't even like electoral politics, she was like, I'm not cool with the system, you know.
She wasn't registered to vote.
No, she was like, And then she worked on her campaign. She got all into it. And she said that that is something that most people don't know about Shirley Chisholm. And when I heard that story, I was like, that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to think about the Congresswoman literally having to swallow down what was so right. About not only was she furious about how Paul Ryan and others had just like did her dirty. They had done all this work, right? And then in the middle of the night, Jeff Sessions, and they just snip, 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 right? And then talk down to her, and she's got to swallow it and calmly explain to you why you're wrong, while also having to not appear too angry because she's black, and then having people congratulate her on not being too angry, which is totally offensive. And how could you not be sad? Like, you're not human if there's not sadness in there about all of the ways in which we are not considered to be human beings. I mean, that's a real thing. So what I said was, that's what's underneath it for me. Like, my anger, like, by the time, it takes me a while to get to actually what's under here is I'm devastated. I'm disappointed, and I'm sad. And so all of those things, I think, go together. Those things don't have to come apart. And in fact, if we're able to connect to that, I think there's forward motion in that too.
Rebecca, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on tone policing, and specifically, I mean, women's tone is policed in various ways, but I'm specifically interested in the phenomenon of other women, especially liberal women, policing other liberal women's tone.
Hello.
Can I just ask you, is there a specific example? I mean, I'm happy. Is there a specific thing you've just heard that you are thinking about and that's in your head?
Yes, there is.
I mean, I'm thinking about Facebook mothers groups. In some ways where politics arise, and especially politics about San Francisco public schools arise, and people get angry, and other
I've
people
heard
are
about
told
these
to sit
groups.
down, and just to reveal a lot about myself here.
Right. Well, I think one of the things about what, I was talking earlier about how we're conditioned to hear women's anger, women's dissent, women's disagreement, and that's in all of us, by the way. It's not just, we are raised in this. We are raised to connect dissent with disruption when it's coming from women. We are, and it really is a matter of adjusting our eyes and ears. And then once you can, it's like seeing the Matrix, right? As soon as you know the code words and
That's right.
right? Like I was on I can't talk about it, but
Yes, you can.
within a group in which I participate, I began to notice that like if I participated in a certain way, there would then be a conversation started separately about tone. I was like, wait, that's about me. And there is a way too that there is a manipulation of a front that happens not just when you're talking about Brett Kavanaugh, who is like mortally wounded by having been accused credibly by multiple women of having assaulted them, and that Donald, 45, has to apologize to the injury done to him and his family. There's a way that happens between women where a response and a defensive response, it's what Alicia is talking about with the tears and that this has caused hurt. And this is that you've somehow perverted a conversation by being too aggressive within it. And now that conversation has caused harm instead of being beneficial. And I think that's going to happen because we are all raised in it and we're all trained to use the weapons we have. Right? And so just as Brett Kavanaugh can reflexively go to the I have been wronged, right? Like that happens with women too, right? And especially women who know that they have in their arsenal an ability to turn on tears and garner sympathy, which tends to be white women. That's in an arsenal, right? And if you're in an uncomfortable conversation and you don't want to be in that uncomfortable conversation, you can suddenly it's there. And I have it too, right? Like we all have it actually. And so part of it is we have to think about, are we using it? Are we using it? Are we doing this thing where we're getting out of something that's really uncomfortable by saying, wait, I think your tone is damaging, or I've been damaged by it, or this has hurt me, and then the conversation's going to be about how it has hurt me. And we can't fix it because it's in the water. We have to just listen for it and be open about describing it and talking about it and hearing it in ourselves too.
Mm-hmm. Ooh.
And this is our last audience question.
Thanks, everybody, for staying to take the question. I appreciate that you're bringing intersectionality into the room and that you're talking so transparently about race. I'm curious, you spoke a little bit about the tasks of the privileged and the tasks of the subjugated. What do you see as the tasks of white women in terms of bringing up their boys, the white men?
Baby, yes, with this last question. That was exactly the question that needed to happen.
It's a great question, and it's one that in some ways I'm ill-equipped to answer because it's pretty close to parenting advice, which I am totally ill-equipped to give. I do have children, but they're not boys, and I'm bringing up white girls, mostly white girls, and but I think that it's talking. I mean, again, who am I to give advice on this? Except that we gotta raise boys, white boys, with the same kind of awareness of their place in a power structure, right? This is a question that white parents ask a lot about. When do I talk to my kid about race? And it's like, wait, do you think your kid doesn't have race until you talk to him or her about it? Because, and this is something that I hear from black parents saying, when was I not talking to my kids about race, right? Because we assume that non-white kids are raced and that white kids are the norm, right? And the same is true around gender. And so for white boys, it's like, when should I talk to boys about gender and power? Well, when do we not talk in some form to girls about gender and power? And so those same questions, I think it's about having those conversations, obviously in forms that make sense for your toddler. You don't need, right? Like, I'm not advocating Audre Lorde for 2-year-olds. However, although my 7-year-old is. But I think that we have to acknowledge that all kids are moving into a world where they're playing a part in a power structure and have responsibility to challenge its abuses. Mm-hmm. And that responsibility is incumbent on them. And we need to raise kids to understand that they are compelled to be engaged in making this country a better place. And that's for everybody. That's not just for the kids who are automatically assumed to be marginalized in some way from birth. It's for the kids who are assumed to be powerful from birth. Mm. And that responsibility sits with them too. Just like the way we're talking about how as a white woman, I have a responsibility to be talking about race. White boys need to be raised understanding their race and their gender and the role that it plays. And then, obviously within each family, how you do this differs. But I just think that there's a way in which we think boys, white men, don't have to worry about this stuff because it doesn't disempower them. So why should it be of their concern? One of the most compelling, this whole thing about I'm worried for my sons, right? And I've been asked by really, really progressive people, parents, like, what do I tell? I'm worried that my son might be misinterpreted, right? That something that he means as flirtation might be misunderstood as harassment or coercion.
Wait a minute now.
Yeah, no. Yeah. No, but this is a common thing. I actually have been asked this question directly by extremely progressive people. Yeah. And it's like, right, so you're concerned that your child might suffer a poor consequence because he's misinterpreted. This is the fear of parents of color every day who have every reason to worry that a toy or a pack of Skittles or a hoodie is going to be misinterpreted as a threat that results in arrest, incarceration, or death of their child. The parents of girls who worry that a single drink is going to be misinterpreted as consent, or that consent is going to be interpreted as sluttiness, and that inebriation and sluttiness are going to prevent a woman from ever bringing a plausible claim if she has been violently aggressed upon. These are the worries about misinterpretation that belong to all kinds of parents who are not the parents of white men. And so we should all be concerned about how we use our power in the world, and we should be concerned about how our children use their power in the world. And for those who might from birth have more opportunity to abuse power, we should make them know from the beginning that they're responsible for not abusing their power.
So, we do have a tradition here at Inforum, which is to ask all of our speakers the following question. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? Ready, set, go!
I was warned about this question directly before the program, and I was like, I swear I'm going to come up with an answer, and I have not done so.
First thought, best thought.
Mandatory naps.
Yes. 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 I'm laughing because my besties are here and they fully agree. They fully agree with this nap thing. Okay, y'all. Thank you so much, Rebecca,
Thank you so
for
much.
joining
Alicia.
us at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. Please remain in your seats after you give her a standing ovation.